Welcome in. It is Big Ten today on day one of the NCAA Tourney. The fact that this is not a national holiday, Trey, is a gross oversight. But I do know there are a lot of people who come down with various 48-hour illnesses right around now. This is a tried and true day for that, but always a fun day today and tomorrow for people who are hoops junkies like us.
Absolutely. I remember as a kid, taking those off days, making sure I had all my homework in and then, staying home for the day and watching all the games. I did that a couple times, and so I apologize to my teachers. But yeah,
this is a basketball family. You're
true.
Permitted to do that, right?
That is true. That is true.
You were just working on your game.
Absolutely. Just watching big-time basketball, getting myself ready, for college basketball eventually. Never made the dance, but, just getting myself ready for big-time basketball. Can't wait for the day.
Well, today should be great. It is, of course, our big story, the 5 teams that are playing today in the Big Ten. Schedule really works out great. The first game of the tourney involves the Big Ten, Maryland and West Virginia. A very limited overlap here. You do have Iowa and Northwestern tipping off 45 minutes apart, so you'll need to have multiple screens going there. Penn State's the nightcap against Texas A&M. 3 more games tomorrow. But let's focus in on today's action. And let's start with one of those 8-9 games. Maryland and West Virginia has been getting a ton of attention. It is a tough matchup, no doubt, for Maryland just because of the style that Bob Huggins' teams play. But West Virginia has not played well down the stretch here. We know Maryland hasn't been great away from home. What do you focus down here?
I think for Maryland, it's just being strong with the basketball after the first initial trap. Because when I look at this West Virginia team, as much as they pressure, as much as they trap, they're 8th in the Big 12 in turning teams over and forcing turnovers. And so this isn't a very good defensive team comparable to, most Bob Huggins teams. And so when I look at that, if you can just attack that first line of pressure and then be able to be strong with the basketball, get into the paint, and then get those kickouts and knock down open shots, I think that's going to be key. I think a big key for this game as well is Dante Scott, because when I look at West Virginia, one of the things that they are very good at is rebounding the basketball. The number 1 team in the country in offensive rebounds, so he's going to have to play strong in the paint, but I also think he can present a mismatch problem for some of the traditional bigs that West Virginia does play, knocking down those pick and pop open threes.
They are a really good offensive rebound team, as you said, and it allows them to get to the free throw line quite a bit. So those are clearly challenges for Maryland. How much do you worry about Maryland away from home and whether or not this has kind of become a thing in their heads? And again, there's a difference between road games and neutral site games. But they're 5-11 away from home this year. They did win 1 in Chicago. They beat Minnesota, but didn't play all that well in the next game, certainly in the second half against Indiana. The talk has certainly swirled around them this year, and I guess I just wonder about that type of stuff from a player's perspective, how much you think about that as you head into a game of this magnitude.
Yeah, it's definitely something to watch, especially because of the way that Maryland likes to play. They like to get up and down. They like to pressure. And so they really fed off the home energy crowd when you look at some of their wins, in conference play. When they were able to make big runs, they're able to trap teams, pick up the pace, pick up the tempo of the game, make teams uncomfortable. And so it's a little bit different in a neutral site or a road game to be able to do that. And then also on the offensive end, it just seemed like even in the Big Ten tournament with IU fans in Chicago, when the crowd started to get into the game, the offensive execution just wasn't quite the same. So I'm sure that's something that Kevin Willard has talked about, especially how West Virginia likes to pressure. But once again, I just go back to the fact, if you can get past that first line of token pressure, that West Virginia gives, that initial ball screen trap, that initial post double, and then be able to be strong with the basketball and kick it out, I think they can have success against this West Virginia team.
A Mountaineers team that benefited from how good the Big 12 is this year. It certainly helped them in terms of the eyes of the selection committee, but they only won 9 of their last 21 games, so 9-12. That's not even down the stretch. I mean, that's the back 2/3 of the schedule. They won far fewer than half their games. So again, I think in some ways feels like a favorable matchup for Maryland. You do get Alabama in Birmingham if you win that game. But first things first. Another 8-9 game, Illinois and Arkansas. This is a really compelling matchup of very athletic teams.
Yeah, talent is going to be off the charts when you look at this game. You talk about Arkansas, Nick Smith Jr., Anthony Black. Those guys are potentially going to be top 20 picks in the NBA draft. Ricky Council is a very talented player as well. Then on the other side, you have Matthew Meyer, Terrence Shannon Jr. I think one thing that I'm looking at is the way that Arkansas plays defense. They pack the paint a little bit. They have great athletes on the defensive end. Terrence Shannon Jr. is going to have to be smart with the basketball and pick his spots and when he wants to drive to the basketball, make sure that he's taking good shots. I think Terrence Shannon Jr. has struggled against good athletes and teams that are able to kind of get into those gaps and stop his drives. And another player that I'm looking at is Jaden Epps and just his health and his ability to get them in offense. When they get into their spread offense, they are a tough team to stop. And when I look at Arkansas, they're a very young team. So you want to make them play defense for 20 seconds on the clock, get them in rotation, get open shots, attack closeouts, don't settle. I think that's going to be the key for the Illini.
As we've talked about all year, Illinois is so much better when they get to the basket. They're not a good outside shooting team. They still take a lot of three-pointers. Right. We have certainly been through that song and dance. How does the length of Arkansas impact Illinois' desire to get to the hoop? Does it, or their ability to get to the hoop, maybe is a better way to put it?
I think it's a matter of when you try to attack to go to the basket, right? Because if you try to just attack, off a couple passes or in transition when you don't have numbers, I think that's when you can kind of get yourself into that no man's land where you get into there and you kind of don't have a place to go. Arkansas's defense is packed. But I think if you can get them moved around, run that spread offense, be able to have good spacing, good pick and roll actions, get the ball on multiple sides of the floor, I think that's where you can create problems. And I think the other thing too, Dave, is when I look at this Arkansas team, they have a lot of young guards. And amongst their guards, they turn the ball over 8 times per game. So I think the Illini can do a really good job, just like they did to end the regular season against Purdue, of picking up the pressure, having Sincere Harris and Ty Rodgers to kind of be the front line of that press and really get Arkansas uncomfortable on the offensive end.
This is an Arkansas program that has fared very well in this tournament, have made the Elite Eight a couple of years in a row. You do sometimes wonder whether those things balance themselves out. They've won some close games in the NCAA tournament. Illinois has not been a great close games team this year, 2-5 in games decided by 5 points or fewer. This feels like a game that might come down to the wire. So we'll see if Illinois is able to reverse that narrative a little bit and then potentially play Kansas, and it would be a matchup against their former coach Bill Self, although Kansas announcing today that Self is not going to coach in their opener as he continues to recover from a medical procedure from this weekend, certainly wishing Bill Self the best. How about the last game tonight involving the Big Ten, Penn State and Texas A&M? Again, we've been talking all week that both these teams feel kind of woefully underseeded. Texas A&M as a 7 seed, Penn State as a 10 seed. I suppose the one positive is they get one another, so it's somewhat offsets itself. Penn State made the great run in the Big Ten tournament. They have been red hot here down the stretch. Can they keep it up here against the Aggies?
I absolutely think they can, and I just love this matchup just because of the fact that Texas A&M is always playing 2 guards that are 6'2" and under. They play a lot of small guards and a lot of traditional bigs. And I just love that for Penn State just because of the way that they play offense. So Jalen Pickett's going to be able to get those switches against some of those smaller guards, get them in foul trouble potentially. And then the other thing, too, is once Jalen Pickett is in the post, when you have those 2 traditional bigs, those guys are going to pack the paint and help. They're not used to playing a guy like Seth Lundy, Miles Dredd, guys who can knock down perimeter shots. So I expect Penn State to get a ton of open perimeter shots. And the other thing that I like about this matchup is that Texas A&M, even though they play 2 traditional bigs, Julius Marble being one of them, former Michigan State Spartan, those guys aren't great scorers in the paint. They're not guys that you can really just throw the ball into and then go get you a bucket. You think about the teams that Penn State has struggled against, teams that just have a lot of size, right? Kevin Jai is going to be a great player, but has kind of struggled against some of the premier bigs in the conference. So I love this matchup just because of the way that Texas A&M plays on the offensive end, very guard-oriented, doesn't have a lot of interior scoring.
Now, Texas A&M is a really good offensive rebounding team. What's interesting about Penn State, they get virtually no offensive rebounds themselves, and that's by design.
Right.
Part of that is, hey, well, first of all, you shoot a lot of threes, but also we're going to drop back and we're going to defend. But defensive rebounding, they really hold their own. I mean, they're a really good defensive rebounding team. Can that offset this strength of Texas A&M here? Because it's a way Texas A&M gets a lot of its points.
Yeah, because defensive rebounding is all about effort and boxing out, right? I mean, if you can just keep them off the glass and not allow them to get those second chance opportunities, now that you can get out in transition and push the pace a little bit, spread the offense around, find shooters. You think about those two traditional bigs that Texas A&M likes to play with. Those guys are going to be getting back in transition, and where they're going to be going. They're going to be going into the paint, because that's just the natural inclination of a big man. So that's why I just really like this matchup, just because I think that Penn State's going to get a lot of opportunities at the three-point line.
It's interesting, too, and we talk about Penn State and being a really good three-point shooting team. Texas A&M has defended the three well statistically this year, but how different is the challenge that Penn State presents versus a typical team that is somewhat reliant on the three? They're heavily reliant on the three, but I think where it's different and where we've seen teams in the Big Ten struggle to adjust is that everyone on the court can shoot it.
Right.
Particularly when they go to that smaller lineup and they take Jai off the court and they spread the floor with four guys around Pickett. Will Texas A&M have to adjust? I mean, can you play those two traditional bigs, or do you foresee Buzz Williams kind of having to make adjustments along the lines of what we've seen some Big Ten teams do and have to take their big guy off the court?
Yeah, I think they'll probably try that, because I can anticipate that Buzz Williams will probably try to play those two traditional bigs. Penn State will knock down some threes. And so, but at the end of the day, though, it's so hard, the challenges that Penn State presents, because of the way that Jalen Pickett posts up. He post ups at different parts of the floor. And so when you play against a normal team, you're used to certain actions, pick and roll actions, post ups in the low block. But you look at where Jalen Pickett posts up, he posts up at the elbow sometimes. Sometimes he's posting up at the 3-point line. And so your rotations are not intact, because you're not used to seeing that kind of style. So it kind of can be tricky, and it's hard to simulate in a scouting report.
Penn State tried to win an NCAA tournament game for the first time since 2001. If you win this one, likely you would get Texas, so the potential of playing A&M and the Longhorns back-to-back. Back on Big Ten today, we already discussed the matchups for Illinois and Penn State today. Big Ten versus SEC. Iowa drawing an SEC team as well in Auburn. They will face them in SEC country, as this game will be played in Birmingham. If you have watched us at all this week, you are well aware of my feelings on this. I have made them perfectly clear. I will not go into it again today, other than to say I think it's patently ridiculous. But it is what it is, so let's talk about the matchup, Iowa and Auburn.
I like the matchup. I mean, I think the biggest thing for Iowa, though, is just keeping the ball in front. When I look at Auburn, they have two guards that are extremely quick, guys that can get into the paint. I look at the Big Ten tournament and the job that they did against Bruce Thornton. He had 21-7, was able to kind of have his way in pick and roll situations and isolation situations. And that's when Iowa has struggled, just when they haven't been able to keep guards in front, whether it's in pick and roll actions or in isolation situations. So I think if they can do that, just because of the way that Auburn kind of can struggle to get offense at times, I think they can force Auburn to take a lot of tough shots. And what that means is long rebounds and their ability to kind of get out in transition and be able to knock down some perimeter shots. The two X factors for me, though, are Tony Perkins and Peyton Sanford. When I look at Auburn and their roster, they have a lot of guys that are strong, athletic, and not to say that Chris Murray and Rebraca won't have good games, but I think that's going to present somewhat of some troubles at certain points of the game for them to be able to kind of get into the paint and do what they do. So I look at the perimeter shooting of those other guys, and Sanford and Perkins, and being able to kind of generate some offense. I think that'll ultimately free up guys like Rebraca and Chris Murray to be able to kind of get into the paint, because now you can't help as much. So I think those two guys are going to be very, very important here today.
Auburn has struggled mightily here down the stretch. They've won just 4 of their last 13 games. One thing that is interesting, and I'm sure you watched over Thanksgiving when Auburn took on Northwestern. I watched the game as well.
Yep.
That was probably the only Auburn game I've watched start to finish this year, and
Right.
the final score was 43-42. But if you look at Auburn this year, there are times, no doubt, where they've struggled to score. They've also scored more than 80 points 9 times.
That's
the SEC is a good defensive league. But if you look at them against the teams that are not strong defensively, and let's be honest, Northwestern's really good defensively, so that may have had a lot to do with them scoring 43 points. But they've gone over 80 points 9 times. And so I do wonder, I think when I first saw this and before I did kind of a deeper dive into Auburn, I kind of felt like, well, I just don't know that they can score with Iowa.
Right.
but they might be able to. And, let's just be honest about Iowa. They are not a good defensive team.
And the Auburn guards are really streaky. I think that's the biggest thing why that you see those games like Northwestern, we're in the 40s, and then some games, as you mentioned, that they're in the 80s. When you look at KD Johnson and Wendell Green, those guys can go for 5 points or they can go for 30. That's just the way that they play. They're going to take a lot of tough contested threes. They're going to have the ball in their hands. They're going to be in pick and roll situations. They're going to try to break you down off the bounce. And so they're just streaky players, and you're going to have to live with the results. So if they make a tough one here and there, you got to stick with your defense. You got to continue to fight over screens. You got to continue to try to keep the ball in front. And then Broome as well is a really good offensive player as well, former teammate of Talon Cooper, a guy that can score in the low block. And so they're going to have to do a good job on him as well, try to keep Rabracha out of foul trouble and play team defense against him because he has great size, is a very versatile player, can step out and shoot the three a little bit. So I think if you can contain those three guys and at least make them be high volume, you're going to have a good chance to win.
Yeah, you mentioned Broome transfer from Morehead State. We'll see with Iowa. Again, they're going to be playing in what, for all intents and purposes, is a road environment unless the Alabama fans just take them under their wing and start rooting for Iowa just to spite Auburn. And we know what Iowa has done away from home in true road games, averaging 20 fewer points per game than they do at Carver Hawkeyes. So that's a tough draw. I know you have at least a passing interest in Northwestern and Boise State. What are you thinking about this one?
Man, the more that I study, the more I look at Boise State, the more I get a little bit concerned. And the reason why is the way that they play offense and the way that Leon Rice likes to run his offense is very similar to how Penn State plays offense. And you think about how Northwestern did against Penn State going 0-2 this year. They really like to spread you out. At times they play 5 shooters. They run a lot of pick and pop stuff. And I think when I look at Northwestern's defense and them trapping ball screens and trapping the post and gambling and risking, and playing in those gaps, I really think that can present some problems on the defensive end for Northwestern. Degenhardt is a guy that can get extremely hot from three. Even though he only averages 1.5 threes a game, he's a guy that can get some pick and pops and some open opportunities, drive closeouts. Rice as well is a really good shooter. So I think there's some concern that I have a little bit just based on the matchup, but I think if Northwestern can be physical on the defensive end and make them uncomfortable, Sharver as well as a guy that can get into the paint, I think if you can take him out of the game, I think that Northwestern could have success here.
Northwestern's got to shoot the ball well, right?
Yes.
I mean, you look at these last 5 games, they have averaged under a point per possession. They've shot 38% from the field. It's just not a winning formula for any time of the year. And it's amazing the degree to which they have overcome their poor shooting this year. It is a huge testament to all of the other things they do well. They don't turn it over. They force a lot of turnovers. Right. They throw teams off with their style defensively. But ultimately, I mean, I hate to oversimplify the game, but at a certain point, doesn't it just come down to if they're making shots, they probably have a great shot to win. And if they play like they did here over the last couple of weeks, they probably lose.
Yeah, I think it's a make or miss game at the end of the day, especially when you get into the NCAA tournament, because if you miss 4, 5, 6 shots in a row, you can assume in the NCAA tournament that the other team is going to at least make 2 or 3 of those shots. And then all of a sudden now you're kind of in a 9-0 hole. And so when I look at that, I mean, I think it's could cause some problems. I did think in that Penn State game, they got a ton of good looks. And so at the end of the day, if you're taking the right ones, if you're taking the ones within the flow of the offense, not going out of the offense and trying to play one-on-one hero basketball, I think it does give yourself a chance. I think at the end of the day, it's just going to come down to just the mental part of it, right? Just being able to, when you get those open shots, believing that you can knock those down, even if they have those cold streaks, being able to kind of come back, bounce back, and be able to knock down perimeter shots.
In an interesting twist, and if you had this on your bingo card at the beginning of the year, then hats off to you. On the Thursday of the NCAA tournament, there are 5 Big Ten teams in action. Northwestern is the only one that is considered the favorite. So we'll see whether or not the Wildcats come through against the Broncos, with UCLA likely next. A really impressive first season for Illinois women's basketball under head coach Shauna Green has come to an end. The Illini lost to Mississippi State in the first 4 of the NCAA tournament Wednesday evening, falling 70-56. It was Illinois' first trip to the NCAA tourney in 20 years, went 22-10, 11-7 in the Big Ten. The action continues tonight with another first four game, Purdue taking on St. John's. Then tomorrow, Iowa, Maryland, Michigan all hit the court in their first round games, followed by number one seed Indiana and Ohio State on Saturday. 4 of the 5 teams that play tomorrow and Saturday will be hosting this weekend. Ben Pickman covers women's college basketball for The Athletic. He joins us now. And Ben, give us a sense of how you think the Big Ten is being viewed heading into this tournament.
I think pretty favorably, right? You look at it, the Big Ten, you mentioned it, hosting a number of first-round games heading into this tournament. And I think they have some teams who, can very easily make a case that they will be Final Four teams, right? I think Indiana is, if not South Carolina, the next best team in women's college basketball all season. I look at them as a possible other team to win the title if you're not picking the Gamecocks. Iowa comes in playing as hot as any team in the country. I think they could very well be a Final Four team. Maryland, for me, another really strong team out of the Big Ten. I looked at them on Selection Sunday. I actually thought they were one of the losers of the 68-team bracket reveal because I think being put in a region with South Carolina is an especially tough draw, but they are as good as anyone or have played as good as anyone. I've had them in my AP top 5 vote, for much of the last month. And Ohio State, again, a team that was, a top 5 AP poll team at a certain point in the season into the new year. A bit of a tough draw, maybe not as hot as some of these other teams we mentioned, but again, they could make another deep run as well. So I think the Big Ten, if you look at it, they have as many contenders as any conference in this tournament.
Been such a fun league to watch from our perspective this year. Highest scoring league in the country, best field goal percentage, best 3-point percentage. So there have been a lot of really compelling games. Let's dive a little deeper into some of those teams. Start with Indiana. We know what an overwhelming favorite South Carolina is in this tournament. But Indiana, you mentioned, maybe next after South Carolina in terms of the teams that are the highest thought of. Give us a sense of what it would take for Indiana to be a Final Four team to play for a national championship.
Well, I want to work backwards, right? I think about with Indiana, it's a veteran team, and I look at them as you mentioned, that other team that could potentially win this NCAA tournament. And a big reason why is if Mackenzie Holmes plays at this kind of first team all-American level, which she's played at all season, she is the kind of player who just maybe could guard Aaliyah Boston one-on-one in single coverage and really create some difficulties, right? And if you're able to cover Aaliyah Boston one-on-one and defend her, not have to throw double and triple teams at her time and time again, it frees up the rest of your players, the rest of your defense to, pick your spots and lock down on the perimeter. Chloe Moore-McNeil's been really good, especially on the defensive end. Grace Berger as well. So this is a veteran-laden Indiana team that also, importantly, 98th percentile assist-to-turnover ratio. They're not going to beat themselves, and I think that's really, really important too, right? Villanova is going to be, I think, a pretty tough matchup in the Sweet 16. Maddie Siegrist, one of the best scorers in the country. She could score 30, 35, 40 points in a game, but I think the depth of Indiana is a little bit overwhelming, and I think the rest of their draw is pretty favorable. And so I like their chances to, get out of the Sweet 16, get out of the Elite 8, and I think win this region and go on to the championship game where I have them playing South Carolina in the end.
Big Ten's first 1 seed in 8 years, so we'll see whether or not they can live up to that. They've just been so good all year. You mentioned Siegrist and what an incredible scorer she is. Caitlin Clark, of course, is a fabulous scorer as well. Iowa's the highest scoring team in the country. I guess my question for you heading into the tournament is, do you believe they're good enough defensively to string together, a minimum 4 straight wins and make it to the Final Four, but maybe even 5 or 6 straight?
I guess I'm not really sure that it matters. I think that's kind of my approach to Iowa, right? They're so good offensively.
Yeah.
Caitlin Clark is so good offensively that I think they can just kind of be middle of the road defensively and advance far in this bracket, right? If you look at it, Caitlin Clark, she's just a transcendent player. And we've seen the advantage they have at home. We know that right now the support is going to be there. In their first 2 games, they were disappointing in last year's NCAA tournament against Creighton, bowing out early. I think you have to look at it and say, she's going to come motivated. There as a group, they're going to be extra motivated. I like their draw long term. I think, it sets up to be really interesting. Stanford in the Elite 8, for me, that could be one of the most interesting and engaging and just enticing games of this entire tournament to see how Tara Vanderveer elects to defend Caitlin Clark, right? You look at it in some of Iowa's losses. In some instances, it's Clark struggles and teams have said, okay, we're going to try and clamp down on Caitlin Clark and let everybody else get theirs. And Iowa has fallen short a few times as a result of that. But in some other instances, I think it was NC State in particular, we saw Caitlin Clark get hers and everybody else struggled. So I'm intrigued to see what Tar Vanderveer, if it gets that far in the Elite Eight, does to defend Caitlin Clark. But Iowa's playing as hot as anyone in the country. I have them in my Final Four. I think if they can play Stanford, if they can beat Stanford, then matching up with South Carolina, I mean, that's must-watch TV. That will be the game of the tournament if Iowa-Stanford isn't already. So I have Iowa going really far, as you mentioned in the story.
First time in 30 years that Iowa has made it to the Final Four, and this team has just been so much fun to watch. Maryland's lost just 3 games in the last 3 months, all of them against top 10 teams. You mentioned you're not in love with their draw. I mean, anytime you face South Carolina, potentially in that bracket, I don't think anyone's in love with the draw. But what would it take for Maryland at least to make it to that Elite Eight game and potentially to give South Carolina a good game? Again, a team that's beaten some really good ones this year.
I mean, for me, it is the draw. I think they are going to be in the Elite Eight. They are an Elite Eight, Final Four quality team. I think what Brenda Frese has done this year with this group has been one of the best coaching jobs of anyone in the country, right? It's almost an entirely new roster with 9 new players. And to see the emergence or the way that Diamond Miller has upped her game even more this year, I think has been super, super impressive. And she set herself up to be, probably the number 2 pick in the WNBA draft going forward. So for me, Maryland, I mean, they're tremendous. Creighton is a dark horse, no doubt about it. They were an Elite Eight team last year. As we mentioned, they knocked off Iowa earlier in last year's tournament, and they're a team that, is a little bit undersized. They move the ball incredibly, incredibly well. So they could be a little bit of a tough stylistic test for Maryland, but I look at the Terps and say, I think if they can get past Creighton, they have a pretty good chance to get to the Elite Eight, and then they match up with South Carolina. South Carolina beat them early in the season. Diamond Miller did not play in that game. South Carolina has been even better in rematches this year when they played a team a second time, so that doesn't necessarily bode well for Maryland if they were to match up in the Elite Eight, but I think an Elite Eight season for this Maryland team, considering the draw they have, that's pretty successful long-term.
No doubt. It'll be the first time past the Sweet 16 since 2015. And again, Diamond Miller helps, so we'll see if it gets to that point. Maryland fans are hoping to find out. It has been a bit of a weird year for Ohio State. I mean, there was a lengthy period, where we were talking about them as the best team in the Big Ten. They started 19-0. They get as high as number 2 in the country. Went through a stretch where they lost 5 of 7, but played well in the Big Ten tournament until the championship game, got a win over Indiana. So what do you make of the Buckeyes as they head here into the NCAA tourney?
I think the press and the fact that they pressure the basketball, throughout the entirety of a game makes them incredibly, incredibly dangerous and potentially a really tough team to play. One of the most, interesting teams to play. I do think they have a particularly tough draw, though, considering the fact they're going to have to play North Carolina potentially in the round of 32. And North Carolina, to me, is one of these teams that is underseeded throughout, the entire tournament, maybe one of the most underseeded teams in the whole draw. Deja Kelly in particular is their playmaking guard, and she is one of the, the best creators in all of women's college basketball, a future WNBA player who I think will likely be a first-round pick probably in the 2024 WNBA draft. So I think that's an admittedly a difficult matchup potentially in that round of 32. But you mentioned J.C. Shelton coming back. She's been a boost for them. And if you look at the Big Ten tournament, Cody McMahon, she was one of the best players in that tournament. She really went up a whole nother level. If she can continue to play the way she played just last week or 2 weeks ago, rather, I think Ohio State has potential to be a Sweet 16 Elite Eight team. I don't think in the end they're going to be a Final Four team, but I think this is still a pretty successful season for Kevin McGuff and that group, even despite not being that kind of AP top 5 team that they were halfway through the year.
Right. I mean, again, were they to get to that point, were they to get past the Sweet 16? It's the first time you've done that in 30 years since they lost in the national championship game to Texas Tech. So it would be successful, no doubt. Michigan, their road is tough. I mean, they open with UNLV, who is really, really good. And then if you win that, you get LSU and Angel Reese. What do you make of this draw for a Michigan team that I think in the back of their minds was hoping they'd have a chance to host, but obviously didn't work out for them?
I think UNLV is one of the toughest teams to evaluate or try and project in this entire NCAA tournament, right? They were 18-0 in Mountain West play. They stormed through the entire conference. But if you look at their non-conference schedule, they really didn't play anybody, right? Oklahoma State was their one kind of big or high-profile non-conference game, and they lost that game. But nevertheless, they come in hot, having stormed through their entire tournament. And Desiree Young, in particular, is one of the best players in that conference. They are a little bit undersized, just like Michigan is, but they're super, they're versatile. They switch a lot. They're a team to watch. And if you look at it, we recently did on The Athletic a kind of coaches poll where we surveyed more than 30 coaches around the country to try and find out a number of different things. And one of the questions we asked was, who is one of the best up-and-coming coaches to watch? And Lindy LaRocque, the coach of UNLV, was kind of the answer we received the most. She was a former Stanford player turned coach, and she has a lot of the same kind of tactical tactical advantages that Tara Vanderveer has kind of put out. She's brought the most out of her players. This is a UNLV program that hadn't made the tournament in 20 years before she got there. They've now made it in 2 of the last 3. So UNLV, I think, is an especially difficult matchup for Michigan. They're a team that is tough to project, but could certainly pull off that upset in the first round. And as you mentioned, it doesn't necessarily get easier from there for the Wolverines if they do get past
Michigan's
UNLV.
Been good in this spot, as you know, Ben. 5 straight wins in the first round, so we'll see whether or not they can continue that. Ben Pickman from The Athletic, really appreciate your time on this. Great insight into the women's tourney, and looking forward to see how all this unfolds for what has been a fabulous league to watch. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Just 2 days away from Michigan and Minnesota facing off in the Big Ten Hockey Tournament Championship. Pre-game coverage begins at 7:30 Eastern, puck drop at 8, Saturday, only on the Big Ten Network and the Fox Sports app. Paul Caponigri here to help get us ready. These two teams played 4 times this year, as Big Ten teams do. Yep. Minnesota won 3-1 in terms of the season series, with the last 2 games in January both went to overtime, so pretty evenly matched. Do you feel like we're in for something similar this weekend? We know Minnesota kind of ran away with the Big Ten ultimately, but you still see this as a pretty good matchup?
I do. I think it's, and those two overtime games were at Mariucci, where this game is going to be played. Relatively healthy teams. They didn't have that in the first weekend at Yost in December. There was a lot of injuries, and Fantilli was out for Michigan. There's just going to be so much speed. You're on the big sheet, Olympic ice. If you don't know, Mariucci's 100 feet wide by 200, so you have that extra 15 feet. And the youth and the skating is going to be remarkable. There's just a lot of little aspects, but I think it's going to be a excellent, exciting, up and down race track of a type game.
You mentioned the young players, and I think that's one thing that really stands out. Give me a sense, how unusual is it to have teams that have so many young stars?
I mean, I want to say it is, but it's starting not to be anymore. The last couple years you've seen it. You saw Michigan have the top 4 of the 5 draft picks. And those guys are coming in now with, they've experienced so much from age 15 to 17, 18. I think you're seeing in all sports that these guys are coming in ready to go. They're not like, let me tip my feet into the water. They're diving right in, and then they're excelling too. So they're gaining trust from their coaches immediately. And then you see the results, and they go out and do it. It's not so much that we'll give you the shot, but they're doing it, and they're putting up these unbelievable numbers. Your top 3 freshmen were the top 3 players offensively in the conference. So it's just really fun to watch. I'm in awe because, I was a pretty good player, but to come in as an 18-year-old, Adam Fantilli's got 60 points in 32 games, and he turned 18 in October.
Right.
So he spent
leading scorer in the country.
Right. He came on campus as a 17-year-old, and he's going to be the 2nd pick in the draft. It's just really remarkable to watch these guys excel at that age and with the confidence they do.
Some of the numbers are remarkable. 83% of Michigan's points come from freshmen and sophomores. That's just crazy, right?
It is, and they needed it, though. Yeah. Because I like their mix of how they do rely on their youth, but they have some older players that fill in that 3rd and 4th and play their roles. Hockey, you have to spread out the lineup. Those guys have to play. You can't just play 6, 8 guys. So they do a good job and give those older guys credit for letting those young guys come in and kind of shine. You kind of relate it with Michigan to the Fab Five. They just came right in as freshmen, and the older guys said, okay, we'll join in and we'll make it a good team by being the extra, the depth.
So I get the sense, obviously, we talk a ton about basketball here.
Right.
And so we're looking forward to the NCAA tournament. We're talking about, I worry about Purdue's freshman guards.
Sure.
And they've infused some of these older guys in
Right.
the lineup, and maybe that helps a little bit. But it seems like from what you're saying, with all the junior hockey these guys play and just how supremely talented they are, that youth is not something that worries you.
I don't, not anymore. They're so good. Their confidence just kind of takes over. Now, in a one-game scenario where everything's on the board, your season's not on the line because both these teams are well in the NCAA tournament and all that. So that'll be another aspect maybe next week when they go there. But I think these guys just play with, I don't want to say reckless abandon. They just carefree. Is that a better word for it? And their skill is just ridiculous. So it just plays itself out, and they don't even think about it.
We talk about how young Michigan is. Minnesota's top 3 scorers are all underclassmen. So, I mean, it's both sides. What about between the pipes for Michigan?
Sure.
Portillo, he has been up and down this year. I mean, was just statistically a lot better a year ago.
Sure.
They played 4 times, as we mentioned, Minnesota and Michigan. He's given up at least 4 goals in every single one of those games, at least 4 in 18 total. Is that like the point of concern for Michigan? Like when you say this is what Michigan has to do, does it just come to a goalie?
I mean, goaltending is the most important position, obviously, maybe second to quarterback, I think, in sports.
Yeah.
And Eric Portillo's funny. I mean, I joke about this off air with Pavlos, our producer. You know, a year ago at this time, Justin Close was the guy that, who is this guy? He was a walk-on for Minnesota from Canada, no expectations to ever play. A year later, you're going to tell him he's got the advantage over Eric Portillo, who was an all-league goalie last year. Yeah. And I just think Close's, confidence has grown. And I don't want to say Portillo's is faltered, but he'll look really good, but then he'll kind of give up one where you're kind of like, it's a head shaker. And those are the tough ones to take as a team because you're not blaming him, but it can slump your shoulders a little out there. You can be like, oh, we got this game, and all of a sudden a puck from far out goes in that no expectation to go in, and you're kind of like, it can demoralize a team. That is one of the little key factors that could come into play in a game that's important and tight as this one could be.
3rd lowest save percentage among regular Division I goalies. I mean, you just wouldn't think about that.
And it's not all on him.
No, I get
Michigan is great,
and they
give up a lot of great chances too. So it's a combination of the team defense as well.
What are the NCAA seeding implications here? Like, help us understand.
Sure.
Minnesota, it feels like it's going to be the number 1 overall seed no matter what happens. Is that? I mean, I don't have the advanced algorithms to figure it out.
Pairwise. I think from what I've read and been told is both are number 1 seeds, and Minnesota right now is the number 1 overall. I think I said it was an 83% chance that they can. If they were to lose on Saturday to Michigan, and then I think Quinnipiac were to win and a few other things, and the decimal points get moved, that Minnesota could drop to the 2 seed. It's not a high chance, like I said, 17%, but that's really the only factor. I don't think Michigan can drop out of a number 1. I thought that the top 4 number 1 seeds are in place. They're the fourth of those number 1 seeds. But right now, Minnesota's is close to as perfect, and they're supposed to go to Fargo if all things line up well.
Big Ten 4 of the top 9 in the pairwise heading into the weekend. Who do you think wins this game?
I like Minnesota. You want to call it revenge factor for last year, maybe. I just think their combination of youth and experience, and then Justin Close and net, how consistent he's been. You just have to rely on that more. If I'm as a picker, if you're relegating this game to that. Their defense, they have veteran with Johnson. If Lacombe plays, we don't know if Faber. That's what I think. They're just a little smarter. They're not as, I don't want to say reckless, but they just don't make as many mistakes as Michigan can sometimes in games. And I think that'll be the difference. I want to say like a 5-3 game, maybe with an empty netter, like 4-3, and then an empty net game goal. Oh,
like that.
Why not? If it happens, I look good. If it doesn't, then people will forget.
Right, exactly. I think Cappy said 5-3 with an empty netter. Look at that.
Only if it happens, then you can say that.
Whoever wins it, will have the lead all time in Big Ten tournament championship
Yep.
wins. They're tied at 2. Notre Dame has 2 as well. So this is
good stuff.
important in terms of bragging rights. Do want to get into the individual awards. We got the Hobie
Okay.
Baker finalists named this week.
Yeah.
There are 10 of them. 3 of them are from the Big Ten. They are all playing in this game. Matthew Nyes, of course, was the Big Ten Player of the Year. Logan Cooley from the Gophers and Adam Fantilli, who we've already talked about.
Right.
How do you like their chances? What are the chances one of these 3 wins it?
I like their chances. Like you said, Adam Fantilli's the leading scorer in the country, and points per game. You average that out. I think he's got the best chance. I don't. It'll be interesting because there's the East and West Coast kind of, or West Coast, Midwest bias. So you don't go too far west in the college hockey world. But I think the exposure that the Big Ten gets, I think a lot of those people still get to see him. And the numbers, it's really hard to this game this weekend, I think this is like kind of the end of the year for voting. This game could tell a lot because it's on a huge stage. It's the 2 best teams. They're both number 1 seeds for the tournament. If one of these guys has a really big game, that might be all it takes. So it could sway to Cooley.
Right.
Cooley's got 50 points. It's not like he's way behind.
Right.
I mean, so any one of those 3 has a really big game on Saturday, that could make a difference.
Speaks to the star power of the Big Ten for sure. You've done such a great job with this all year. Really appreciate it. Of course, we'll look forward to the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, I'm
seeing how
excited.
this all plays out. How many Big Ten teams do we think?
4. It's a solid
for
4. And I think
Michigan
that's
State
it. Michigan State
do it,
can't,
right?
without playing, they can't move up, I don't think.
Right,
It's
right.
capable.
All right, well, we will see. We'll see if this is the year the Big Ten hoists a national
It's time,
championship.
10th year, let's do it.
We are ready to go. All right, Cappy, enjoy the game
Thank you.
this weekend. Wrapping up Big Ten today with more men's hoops. We focused on today's game so far. I want to give you the entire scope of the tourney. The other 3 Big Ten teams open up tomorrow. Michigan State gets it started against future Big Ten foe USC. Purdue will take on Fairleigh Dickinson, and Indiana in the late game against Kent State. Trey's back with me for the last few minutes here. Wanted to highlight a handful of Big Ten players who you think there's going to be focus on, need to play well in this Big Ten tourney, and you are starting with Northwestern.
Yeah, I think it's Chase Audige. Has only shot 40% since the month of February. A guy that I think that can get hot in this type of setting. Can almost think of it as a new season, playing in the NBA gym. A guy that can make incredibly tough shots, a 3-level scorer. So I look at Chase Audige as a potential guy that I think that in this tournament setting against a Boise State team that doesn't have a ton of size, if he can get past that first line of defense, they could finish at the rim and get hot.
And you know what you're going to get from him on the defensive end. The variable with him is the offense, but one of the best defensive players in the country. Heading to Michigan State next.
I think Malik Hall, in their Big Ten tournament loss, 3 points, 0 of 6. They need him on the offensive end, a guy that can score in the low block. Now look at their opponents, USC, then potentially Marquette. Those 2 teams have a ton of size that could potentially cause Michigan State's guards to have some problems on the offensive end. He needs to be a complimentary scorer for them to advance.
Double figures in 4 of their last 6 games, as you said, did not play well in the Big Ten tournament. For Indiana, everyone knows about Trace Jackson-Davis, Jalen Hood-Schifino. You've got your eye on a different player, though.
Yeah, I think it's Trey Galloway. And, even though I'm not looking necessarily at the scoring, even though that they're 7-1 when he scores in double figures, I just look at the energy that he brings, the toughness and the edge that he brings to this team, and then also the ball handling responsibilities, right? You talk about the teams that they potentially could play. Kent State and Miami, 2 teams that really get into you, that are good defensive teams. They needed an additional ball handler to go along with Jalen Hood-Schifino to advance.
We're going to dive more into this game tomorrow, but Kent State, they're good. A lot of people are picking this as a potential upset. You look at them, they played Gonzaga this year and Houston. They lost by a combined 12 points, both games on the road. So it's going to be a challenge, no doubt, for the Hoosiers. How about for Iowa? Who's your focus there?
I think it's Peyton Sanford. And once again, Iowa lost their first game in the tournament. Peyton Sanford, 4 points, 1 of 3. They need his shooting. They need his offense to space the floor. They are 6-0 when he hits 3 threes or more. So they need him to be able to get hot from the perimeter, also attack closeouts against 2 potentially physical defenses to take the pressure off of Chris Murray and Rabracha.
Only Chris Murray's hit more threes this year for Iowa than Peyton Sanford, so he is clearly a key guy for them. And you finish up with another outside shooter.
I think it's Andrew Funk, and the Penn State team is 1-6 when he's in single digits. They need him to be in double figure scoring, be able to come off of stuff, knock down perimeter shots. That's going to allow Jalen Pickett to play a little bit more one-on-one in the post, because if he knocks down a couple threes, now you have to think twice on whether you send those doubles and get yourselves in rotation and potentially leave him open.
You want to talk about a great portal pickup? He was a great portal pickup. There is one power conference player who's hit more threes this year than him.
Wow.
And it's Brandon Miller.
Wow.
It's pretty good. Enjoy the madness. We will see you same time early on Friday.